What's up, everybody? Joe Ringen here, coming to you tonight with another cool book review. This time, I hope the background is okay, but it looks kind of goofy. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about actually a collection of stories. It's not so much a book like we think about a book, but it's a very important piece of literature, especially for sci-fi and fantasy fans. This is the Poetic Edda. And the version I have is by Jackson Crawford. So, before I get into this, I want to let you know I wrote a book too. It's called The Ballad of Ages, Tale of Epic Fantasy. Pick it up if you like, but honestly, pick up Poetic Edda first. And I'll tell you why in this video. All right, so if you watch my other videos, I'm a big fan of fantasy and sci-fi for sure. For some reason this year, I've really just wanted to, I'd like this nagging desire to learn more about like the origins of fantasy and story and things. At least the ones I like. So, I've sort of delved back into history and tried to find some of the tales of ancient cultures and things around the world that would help me to understand the modern stories that I like to read. And I say modern, really 20th century and up. I don't know. My personality just is just like that. I like to understand the root of things, like in music. I love music, so I had to understand what it is and how it works. So I got a degree in music. I'm too old to go back to college and get a degree in literature, and too poor. So I'm doing some self study along with YouTube, and it's awesome. A lot of fun. But anyway, so I came across Poetic Edda, just researching online and finding really smart people on YouTube. And this is like, I don't know. It seems like it's the key to all fantasy. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why as this video goes on. But first, so again, what is it? So it's a collection of stories, like myths, but they're poems, written as poems of Norse culture. And then in Viking Age. So think Viking Age, the TV show Vikings, that time period. Such a cool period for us. Like on the outside of it, probably wasn't as fun living through it. It was a warlike culture with some really brutal landscapes. And it's crazy to read this. So this strikes home to me a lot more because I have Scandinavian roots and I live in Minnesota, so it's kind of very similar like climate as like Norway and Sweden and stuff. So, I did a video not too long ago of the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights. And so I love those. And I can even just imagine like people that live in the desert or grew up in the desert, those just resonate so much more. That's this for me. Just something just harkens to you if you understand what it means to live in a cold climate and just the really beautiful fall weather where the leaves are changing. And there's something these stories really resonate with that. And so it's an added element to these stories if you live in that type of climate. But anyone will love them. Anyone will love them. So there's these poems, and you can see they're not super like long. It's not like Dante's Inferno where it's pretty, or like Paradise Lost where it's pretty like dense. They're pretty, very readable, very digestible as poems. And this translation in particular, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But anyway, so they're pretty easy. Honestly, it took me only a week to read this. It could have been quicker too. They go pretty fast. But so they're split up in sections. So there's one section about the Norse gods. So like Thor, Odin, Loki, all those characters that, they're still in culture, like in Marvel stuff, but they're different than in the Viking Age, but some similarities. So you learn about them. There's poems about their origins and their quests and things, and they're fine. They're pretty cool. That wasn't my favorite section, to be honest, but it was good. The cool thing about that section is you learn a lot about Norse culture through it because you can see what they sort of believe and what their lives are like through the gods that they believe in or created. Um, the other thing is, and the translator pointed this out, and it's pretty cool. So this really isn't like a religious text, even though it's very much about the gods. It doesn't tell you how to like worship these gods, Thor and Odin. It doesn't like tell you how. It just tells you their stories. So it's in that way, it's kind of like reading a comic book, right? It's like a tale of myths. So the Norse people definitely believed in these characters as gods. So I don't want to like paint it as they're just these like characters. They were very important in their lives, but you don't have to read this thinking it's going to convert you into a pagan or something like that. So you can be a Christian like me and totally read these and just enjoy them, and it's more like history, kind of like watching the Marvel stuff. Although these are way cooler than the Marvel stuff. There's also a section which I loved about it's like the wisdom section. Very much as Jackson Crawford, the translator, said in his intro, very much like the wisdom literature of the Bible. So like Proverbs, Psalms, very much like that. More like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. These are it's just like practical advice from Odin, right? Telling his people or his sons how to live, how to work with neighbors and kings and enemies, and just how to survive like life in a brutal landscape such as Norway or Sweden in a warlike situation, how to live and how to enjoy life. And it's not necessarily, it's very cool because even Odin is saying like it's not the things you have, but the people around you and the relationships that make you happy, or basically the simple things. So a lot of wisdom that is very useful not only in battle but in the arenas of today, like business or sports and stuff. The last section that I loved, and I'll probably reread multiple times, is a section about the heroes. And I was not expecting that. I thought the section about the gods was going to be my favorite. The section about the heroes was so good. And it just, I couldn't put the book down. And it's like, this is almost like a textbook. Like you could read this in school, but it felt more like, I don't know, felt more like a fun book. And it's about the heroes. So, the big ones, the ones I love the most are about the Volsungs. And this, I am convinced, this set of stories about the Volsung family is at the root of like every fantasy story of Western culture ever. Like there's something that derives from this. It's just like a very tragic tale about heroes and war and love lost, and there's all these love triangles and there's just battles, and it's very tragic and just very somehow relatable. Like I think everyone can somehow relate to these characters, even though it's a totally different setting and just kind of crazy stuff happens. But it's also fantastical. Like it's like a fantasy story. Like the hero goes to the fortress and then rescues the Valkyrie, who is trapped there, like surrounded by a circle of fire, and he rescues her, and she gives him wisdom, and they kind of fall in love, and there's like a love triangle. It's cool. It's just like very fun stories. And if you haven't recognized it by now, so it's Sigurd. So he's very popular in not only Scandinavian but German too. I think Wagner, like the Ring Cycle, is his operas. So very good. I loved the hero story. Sigurd, all the characters, the Valkyries, what's her name? Gutrid, his wife, and the tragedy that follows. Oh man. And there's a lot of different mediums for these stories. Like there's a lot of different, I think J.R.R. Tolkien actually made a translation of this story. Very famous and central story. in Western literature for sure. And it comes from the Viking. It's like the Vikings, like, I don't know. They're not only just brutal people, but they're smart. They're very smart and important people. The other thing is, which was so interesting about these stories, is you'll recognize there are, it's J.R.R. Tolkien with his Lord of the Rings is super inspired by these stories. So much so that there's even names that he pulls from it that are very familiar. Bombur, Nori, Thorin, Fili, Kili, Oakenshield. Oh, and a little person named Gandalf. Yep. And this famous forest in these stories called Mirkwood. Directly from the Poetic Edda. Super cool. Super cool. And I think, he said that in his interviews and his writings that he's very inspired by the Norse mythologies and things. But, man, it was just fun to read that. And then, Gandalf is often described as the Shadow Wanderer or Greybeard, and Odin is described as those things in these. So, pick it up. If you're a fan of fantasy, read Poetic Edda. There's also a version called the Prose Edda, and that's more of like a narrative version of these stories. But I almost bought that one actually, but I found that the Poetic Edda, the poem format, actually retains more of the original aspects. So I went with that. And this translation I think is very approachable. It's like, he translates it so it's not so much the ancient Norse language, which is easy to read because it's pretty similar to Germanic and English. But this is even easier to read. And he combines names. I guess the original has different names for the same person, so it's confusing. But in this version, he combines names for the same person. But he also keeps the meter and the rhymes, so it still feels like poetry. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, Poetic Edda. If you like fantasy, read this. I'm going to reread it. And especially if you have if you are interested in the Viking culture, or you have like Viking roots in your blood, like I do, it's just gonna it'll hit home. It's very good. I'm gonna keep finding like myths and the roots of fantasy stories through other cultures and stuff. I'm gonna keep doing that this summer. That's my project, and then hopefully I'll build a better understanding foundation, and I'll continue reading more like 20th century fantasy and have a much better understanding of it. But I'm glad I found this. I really do think Poetic Edda is the root of all of fantasy, of Western culture at least. Maybe I'll find something else, but it just seems like this is the one. So check it out. It's awesome. But that's all for today. Until next time, you all have a great night.